Hello everyone, this is Tim Woskett from Stonebait Games. Now today I'd like to talk to you about this little starry background that I've got going on in my 2D space game. So I've been working on this 2D space game for a little while and I wanted a nice interesting background, so I thought I would write a custom shader to create some nice sort of distribution of brightness and spread of random stars. So I'm going to switch to edit mode now and I'll demonstrate the process of putting this shader together. So this is what it looks like in edit mode. You can see actually it's done in screen space. So if I move the camera view around, you can see everything stays in place on the screen rather than moving with the world. So there's a good reason for that, because stars are at an infinite distance. So you basically want them to not really move that much. You can have very subtle parallax, and I've got some going on in this particular example, but you want that to be super subtle. So the basis of this shader starts with everything working in screen space and then calculating based off of that. So what I've actually got here is two layers. So I've got a set of nearby stars, which are these bright ones, and if I toggle that on and off, you can see that's what those look like. And then I've got a set of more distant stars, which are more faint, and you can see those are the small faint ones there, which I can turn on and off there. So what I'm going to do is just work on one layer for the purposes of this demonstration. So I'm going to work on the near stars. So let me just demonstrate how I've set this up. I've got my main camera, which actually renders to this rectangle here, and I've got a black background, which just is a sprite which fills the whole screen. The reason for that is because the stars are actually rendering to a transparent background. So I've just added this black square so that they can show up in edit mode. This actually gets disabled when I run the game, which means that I can layer up as many layers of different stars as I like, and they all layer on top of each other without obscuring each other. So you can see that there. What I've done in order to be able to render these stars is actually create a square sprite. So I'm using sprite renderers here for everything, because I need to be able to control the depth where the stars render. So I want them to render in the background, so that everything else in the world, in the foreground and the world geometry, all renders on top of those. So that's why I'm using a sprite renderer as opposed to just a sort of standard mesh renderer. You can do mesh renderers as well. You could just draw this to a quad, for example. But what I did was I just created a square sprite, which is just a square which fills the entire screen, and I've just stretched it to fill the camera. And I've got a script on that which expands the sprite to always fill the full view of the camera. That's not super important, just to make sure that that I'm not sort of rendering beyond the bounds of the camera, because there's no point really doing that. So let me show you a few of the controls for this. I've actually got a control here which deals with the parallax and some rotation and all that other stuff. I'll show you a little bit about that later, but I'm going to turn that off for now, because this actually overrides the settings of the shader. So I need to turn that off to be able to demonstrate the various properties. So there's a few controls here that I've provided for the shader. We've got an overall scale. All that does is you can see it just expands and contracts the whole thing. I'm going to leave that at, for this particular one, I'm going to leave that at 1.5. I've got a tint for the color of the stars. So let me just show you if you can, you can change this to whatever color you like. You might want to make a nice sort of yellow stars, for example. I'm going to leave this particular layer as white. But for my more distant stars, I've actually given them a very slight pale tint, just for a bit of variety. I've also got then a few other controls that dictate the size of the stars. So as I decrease this control here, I've called this clip threshold. That will become clear later why I've called it that. But you can see that actually expands the size of the stars. I'm just going to undo that for now. The star scale and the brightness variation scale, this sort of does the same thing as the overall scale, but they control two subtly different things. So the star scale, it makes it look like it's doing the same as the overall scale, but what it's not doing is changing the variation of the brightness. So I've actually got this second control because let's say if I drop that right down to 0 and then scroll it back up, you can see it's flickering the stars. Now that's a very subtle effect, and it's not obvious what's going on there, but it should become clear when I run through the shader what that's doing. But I'm just going to undo both of those changes for now. The other thing I've got is this randomness slider. So I'm going to put this down to 0, and you can see, probably get an idea of what's going on here. So you can see when I put it to 0, everything's lined up as a grid, and then as I increase it, everything sort of jitters around and becomes a bit more random. So that might give you a clue as to what's coming up next. And then I've got brightness, power, and brightness here. So these are two controls that give you the ability to make the stars brighter than the sort of standard rendering of 1, which is you know, when you draw pixels to the screen, you can draw them, you know, obviously between 0 and 1 for any of the colors. But if you want bloom in your game, then you need to be able to draw higher than 1. So you can see this star here and this star here. All these bright ones have got a bit of bloom associated with them. So I've got the post-processing which does that. I'm not going to bother going into that because there's plenty of videos that deal with bloom. But this will these two controls allow you just to the degree of brightness above 1 and how you want that to appear. So you can sort of vary the amount of brightness that the brightest stars have, and again the calculation will be obvious once I show you the shader. Then we've got this rotation, which allows you to rotate the camera, and the rotation of the stars in the background will compensate for that rotation of the camera to make it appear that they're still you know, aligned to the world, even though it's done in screen space. And then I've got an offset which just allows you to scroll the stars backwards and forwards or up and down, and that will allow you to add some parallax if you want, which you might want very subtle parallax, but don't overdo it is my recommendation there. So I'm just going to click that back on, and that will override all of those things. So without further ado, let's go into the shader itself and show you what all of those controls do and how they're put together. So I'm just going to push this down to the bottom here. So what we've got here is it looks quite complicated, but honestly it's not super bad. Once you break down each individual component, it's quite straightforward. At the far left here, we've got all the positional stuff. We've got some rotations and translations. That all happens here. Then we've got the interesting bit, which is the actual generation of the stars themselves, and we do that with a couple of the noise modules. And then we've got the controls that change the brightness. That's all this stuff here. And then we deal with how we convert the brightness into the color space and the alpha channel right at the far end here. So I've got the main preview showing, and you can see we've got a few stars with different brightnesses, but really, like, none of this stuff tells you how we end up at this point. So I'm going to show you a few key points. I won't go through the whole thing because I'll make this shader available for you to for your own purposes, and you can tinker with it as you like. But just to give you an idea of how it's put together, it all starts with this Voronoi module here. So this is a standard noise module, and it's one that comes, you know, baked into Unity. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete the alpha channel for now. So let's just get rid of that, and it goes to full white now. There's a good reason for that, and I'll explain that in a minute. And I'm just going to take the output from the Voronoi module and plug that straight into the color. And this is what the Voronoi noise module produces. So it's a series of cells which run from white at the borders between the cells up to black at well, this is the intercept between the borders here. So we've got black points, and then we've got white borders which basically subdivide all of these cells. So what I thought was, well, these little black blobs, effectively you could create stars using these black blobs. So if I invert the color of all of those, then you can see where we're starting to get here. We've now got the white areas which we could use as stars, and we just need to trim off everything else, get rid of all the rest of it. So what I've got here is this is the clip threshold which I explained earlier, and as long as you set it reasonably high, it will trim off everything except for the brightest parts here. So the typical range I've set here is from 0.9 to 0.99, and the default is 0.95, but you can experiment for your own purposes. And all I do there is I take that clip threshold and I just remap this to basically say that everything that's below the clip threshold becomes black, and everything above it stays as whatever value it comes out of the noise module. So if I then show you what the output of that looks like, put that into the color, now you can see we've just got, all we've got left is now the brightest parts of that Voronoi, those Voronoi cells. Okay, so we've just got the bright bits there. So that's fine. That will give you some nice random distribution of stars. And in fact, what you can do, where is it now? Here we go. Here's the randomness. So you can have this thing called angle offset in the Voronoi noise module. And let's say if I set that to 0, this is exactly what I did before. And you can see that the Voronoi output just creates a grid. And then if you change this to anything other than 0, for example 5, it will just scatter them around randomly. So that's how I was able to do that random thing. And just set that up as a property that's exposed, and it means you can then control how random the distribution of your stars is, and you can make them more or less random. But having random distribution doesn't make for a nice random set of brightnesses, right? You want some bright stars and you want some dim stars. So in order to do that, I layer on a second type of noise, which is called gradient noise. So this is effectively Perlin noise, right? So it's a sort of weird. Well, let me show you. So if I plug that in, it's a weird sort of smooth distribution of light and dark. So we've got black is 0 and white is 1. And in actual fact, that's not quite true. I think so. The documentation is very unclear, but I think that the black that comes out of this Perlin noise module, I think, is -1 actually, and the white I think is +1. So it's really not obvious, but what I do is here is I just saturate it to make sure that the output is between 0 and 1. So you can see where I'm going with this. If I've got some lighter areas and some darker areas, if I just multiply those together here, I can then take the distribution of Voronoi stars, which are obviously all just the same brightness, multiply that together with my Perlin noise map here, and I get out at the end of that, there we go, I've got some areas where the Voronoi stars overlap with the dark parts of the Perlin noise, become dark, and where they overlap with the whiter areas of the Perlin noise, they stay nice and bright like that. Okay, so it's that's pretty simple. And that gives you your variation in both. So the Voronoi gives you the variation in distribution, and then the gradient noise, this sort of Perlin noise generator, gives you the variation in brightness. So here's why I've got those two different controls. Okay, so I've got my stars scale, which I use to vary the what's called the cell density of this Voronoi distribution, right? So that changes how far apart the individual cells are of the Voronoi noise module. But I want the gradient noise to be controlled differently. So let me just let me plug this back in again into here, and I'll just show you what that means. So I've got this the brightness scale variation here, and if I change that up and down, let's change it to 0.1. So you can see it becomes the scale becomes much larger and more spread out. If I change it to 10 times greater than that, you can see it becomes much smaller, right? So the variation from one part of the map to the next is much more high frequency. So I just set this to something sort of in the middle, so that it gives it a nice sort of variation without being too crazy. But you can fiddle with those and tinker with them to give the distribution that you prefer. So once we've got the nice random variation in brightness and the nice random variation in distribution of the stars, we can then start to apply all of this stuff here. So let me go back to there we go. So we've got just got our random brightness and random distribution of stars. But what we would then want to do is apply various factors to this to make sure that we can make the bright stars super bright, and maybe the dim stars a little bit dimmer. So in order to do that, I just pass them through a series of multiplications and power modules here. So we take what's coming out of the noise modules, we saturate it, so that's just a clamp between 0 and 1, so that we know then that absolutely everything that's coming out of that is now between 0 and 1. There's no sort of 1.1 or -0.1 or whatever it happens to be. So we're clamped between 0 and 1, We then multiply by the brightness. So for example, let's say the brightness is 2, then now we've got outputs between 0 and 2. But then if we want to make the bright ones really bright, we pump it through this power module, and that then makes the bright things really, really bright and the dim things dimmer. And we do that using the, well, here we go, we've got the brightness power here. So I've put the default as 2 here, of 1 here, but if I pump that up to 2, and also increase the brightness by 2 as well. So what we've now got is any star that starts out bright, close to 1 gets multiplied up to be 2, and then it gets put through the power module, and so that will have a brightness of 4. Okay, but if there's a star that's that starts with a brightness of half, right, it gets multiplied by the brightness to become 1. And then that goes into the power module. Obviously 1 to the power of 2 is still 1, so that's that becomes a brightness of 1. So you've got now, rather than a variation in brightness of a factor of 2, you've now got a variation in brightness of a factor of 4. So that just makes sure that the variation that we created using the gradient noise, this Perlin noise, now becomes emphasized, and you've got an even bigger distribution of brightnesses, which I think is quite useful. And you've then got 2 more controls that allow you to vary that and give it the sort of the look that you're after. So this bit right at the far right here, this is just allows you to control the alpha of your of the background. So you can see here the way I'm drawing these colors, you've got a black background with white stars, but if you were to layer a second set of stars on top of this, it would just completely obscure it. So what you want is all of the black to be transparent, and only the areas where you've got the stars to actually show through. So let's, for sake of argument, just plug everything back in together. Where are we here? I think it's this one here. Right, so now we've got a transparent background, because what we've done is I've taken the final output from the power module here, which is just the stars on a black background. I clamp it back again to between the range of 0 and 1. And then I put that basically into the alpha channel. And I've then also multiplied by the star tint here and taken the alpha of the star tint, just because that then gives you the ability to change the alpha of all of the stars together just by changing the alpha of the tint color. You don't really need to do that, but I've just done that as a little extra. So what that means is that because obviously alpha only ever runs between 0 and 1, if you've got an alpha of more than 1 or less than 0, that it doesn't do anything for you. So I've just saturated what comes out of the power module, plug that effectively straight into the alpha. And that means that everything that's black becomes transparent, and everything that's white shows through. And what I've done for this section here, obviously the star tint changes the color of all the stars in the same way. So that's what that multiplication does here. But I've also added this add 1 on to what comes out of the color here. So what I'll show you how that works here. If I just plug, get rid of the alpha completely, you can see that everything becomes white. But that's a bit of a lie, because obviously the stars that are getting generated by this output here get added on top of a flat white background. So effectively this add creates a flat white background, right? And then the stars are all just sort of little extra bright patches on top. Now the reason I've done that, if I didn't have this add 1 on here, you would get some weird effects around the edge of the stars. So if I then plug back this alpha in, because the alpha has a slight ramp right on the edges of these stars, it goes from, not necessarily, so you've got 0 in the background, but then you've got some non-zero values all along the edge of the star, going up to 1 right in the center of the star. Really what you want is the full star to be a sort of a transparency of, well, completely opaque in the star itself and transparent around the background. But you want that to be representative of the brightness of that star. So I'm not really making a lot of sense, but suffice it to say that by doing this, you make sure that when you combine it with the alpha, everything that's coming through in the color appears properly when it's rendered onto the transparent background. And you can experiment a little bit. You can take that out and see if it makes any difference. It doesn't make a lot of difference, but it's just an extra little bit of polished to make sure that it's sort of makes the edges of these stars look much nicer if you zoom right in. If you have very large stars, for example. So that's all of the main sort of generation of the stars. The bit that I haven't gone into just yet is all this stuff over on the left. Now this just deals with the screen space positioning of this shader. So what I've done is I've taken the screen position, split that out into red and green, and the reason I do this is because I need to adjust by the aspect ratio of the screen. So I take the screen, I create the aspect ratio here, which is just the width divided by the height. So for example, a 16:9 screen, you want it to be wider than it is tall, and that just multiplies the red channel of the screen position. So that's the X position, and it just multiplies it by the aspect ratio. So it stretches it out so that the stars don't become elongated. So it makes sure the stars always stay circular when they're on the screen, regardless of the aspect ratio. I then combine that back together to create a vector 2 effectively. That's what this RG channel, when you combine the two together, you've got the X and the Y, and that pops out here. I then multiply it by the overall scale. So this is the scale control that I showed right at the beginning, and I've just divided this through. So I've taken 200 and divided by the overall scale, so that when the scale gets bigger, that means that that this becomes larger rather than smaller. So it's rather than a higher scale creating a smaller distribution of stars, it looks better when you have this this system of dividing it through. So we then put that through the multiply, and that expands and contracts this. And then we've got this rotate module here, which it just takes the rotation and applies it in degrees. And the reason I've done that is so that if you have a system like in my game where you can rotate the camera, you can change the rotation of the screen space rendering of this set of stars so that it compensates for it. And then the offset is just again, it's just a couple of vectors, or rather it's a vector 2, which allows you to control the X and the Y. And that gives you the ability to shift all of the stars left and right or up and down to give you a little bit of parallax. And that's all that does. So none of this stuff here is particularly complicated. It's just controlling all of the screen space rotations and translations as and when you want to use those. And the rest of it I've explained. So let's go back to the game and demonstrate it once again so that you can see how that all fits together. Right. So let me tell you what I'll do. I'm going to enter play mode. I'm going to turn this back on again, and I'm going to turn. There we go. So you've now got the two layers on top of each other with the faint and the bright stars. I'm going to go into play mode and demonstrate it one more time. I'm going to turn off my little performance indicator at the top there. So here we go. We've got my little spaceship. I can take off. Now I'm in what I call landing mode at the moment, where I'm locked to the rotation of the planet, and you can see as I'm rotating, the stars rotate around as if they were still in the background. But if I then go into sort of what I call free flight mode, space flight mode, you can see it zooms back and it rotates around so that everything's sort of locked in position. And if I go into map mode, you can see it zooms out, but the stars stay more or less exactly the same size, even when I zoom in and out. But there's a very subtle shift there. So you may notice that as my ship is floating around the planet, you get a little bit of this flickering. Now that doesn't seem to happen in the build version of the game, and now I think this is because when you're rendering in the game, it's not at full resolution, and the bloom, because the stars are very small. I'm about to crash into this planet, so let me just avoid that. When the bloom acts on only 1 or 2 pixels, it has trouble identifying exactly what pixels are bright and what's not, so it sort of blooms intermittently. But when when the game is properly built and you run it and run the actual build, this seems to be much less of a problem. But of course, what you could do if you want that flickering effect, what you can do is actually you could change this brightness variation. For example, you could have that hooked up to a script and just vary that subtly, and that will give you a little flickering effect entirely under your control. So there we go. That's everything. It's been a bit of a rambling video, but there you go. That's the way these things go. I hope you find a use for this. I think it's pretty neat. Yeah, let me know if you make use of this. I'll have a link in the description where you can download this the shader graph file for your own purposes. I'm using Unity 2019.3 for this particular version. It should be reasonably stable, but yeah, there's no guarantees, I'm afraid, because these things seem to change all the time. But yeah, if you do find it useful, let me know. I'll be interested to know if you create anything which makes use of it. But other than that, I hope you've enjoyed watching this, and if I think of anything else useful to add, I will create another video as and when. Thanks for watching.